source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. Three successive lead investigators have tried for over 10 years to solve a potential Jane Doe murder case. There are no reports, no witnesses, no leads, not even a name. All they have are human skeletal remains that were washed ashore and scattered around Gilbert Island near Fredericton, New Brunswick. Fall 1992. A duck hunter travels to the island to build a blind. It's a wild, uninhabited place, isolated from the rest of the world by the waters of the St. John River. Suddenly, in a pile of dead branches and driftwood, the hunter makes a grisly discovery. Unaware of the consequences for the investigation, he moves the skull and goes to notify the police.
I'm already beginning to think, how did it get there? Along the St. John River system, there have been occasions that the old burial grounds were close to shore, and we have had occasions where some of them have washed away. So you have to think that. You have to think, is it a missing person? You have to think, is it foul play?
RCMP Corporal Dave Brown and Joseph Hine, a forensic technician, accompany the hunter to the island. If the hunter really has found human remains, the investigation is liable to be complicated.
The skull was actually in the crotch of a branch of a tree. The gentleman that had found it had picked it up and put it there so he would be able to find it again.
The skull is not complete. The entire lower jawbone or mandible is missing along with several teeth. There is nothing left on the bone, not a shred of flesh. Joseph Hine takes the skull to the forensic lab.
We still don't know what we have. We don't know if this is a suicide or an accident or a murder. So you treat it like a murder until you know otherwise.
The hunter shows the investigators where he actually found the skull.
It's quite a big island. They put cows on there in the summertime to graze, so it's fairly big. I'd be taking a wild guess, but I'd have to say 30 or 40 acres anyway. But it floods almost completely in the spring. Like I would say, virtually the entire island is underwater in the spring. The three of us just had a look around, just a cursory look about 100 yards around the skull to see if we could find any other bones or any other indication of a body, and we didn't find anything.
Moira McLaughlin is a forensic anthropologist from St. Thomas University in Fredericton. Investigators assist her in the search of the island for more remains.
This river is deceptive. It looks very wide and peaceful and beautiful, and yet the actual channel of the river is quite narrow. Most of what we see is overflow. The current in the channel is exceptionally strong. Remains, a body could be carried very, very rapidly, many kilometers in hours.
The island is subject to flooding. It's possible the water either deposited the skull there or carried the skeleton downriver.
And as we were coming up to the backside of the island, I saw a nesting pair of eagles, and I think that'll always remind me, and in retrospect, it was rather prophetic.
Before starting the search, the team examines the island and discusses a plan of attack. The search team consists mostly of volunteers. They receive clear instructions to protect the scene and preserve the tiniest pieces of evidence.
In an area that we thought perhaps would be outside of the area that we might have to concentrate on, we started locating small bones. And as the search progressed, as we're going down the grid, we noted that we were finding more and more.
Among the bones, the search team also finds tattered remains of clothing.
The underwear and the sock were in such a condition that they really told us very little, other than bones were found in them. So we were able to deduce that they were on at the time of death. So that's an important clue.
After several days, the team discovers what looks like a little ball of animal fur or human hair. The little hair will be carefully retrieved and sent to the forensic laboratory.
And as we walked upstream along the island, this scattering of bones became more and more narrow until we found an area where there was a lot of dead branches and debris. And in that pile of dead branches and everything else, we found some of the larger bones. And the area where the skull was found was quite a distance from this fanning out. So the water had moved it quite a distance, actually.
Finally, an almost complete skeleton has been collected.
Maybe 80% of it. There was, the feet weren't there, but they're very small bones and they're so light that they could be carried away. Where the postcranial body was, that is, everything below the cranium was found, had been flooded many times. And those little bones of the hands and the wrist and of the feet and the ankles would easily have been swept away.
The water has hidden a key piece of the puzzle, the lower jawbone. Without that, it will be next to impossible for a forensic expert to determine the shape of the face.
We did several searches of the island. We never did find the jaw because, water took that away. It took away the important thing.
The police have not found any distinctive marks on the bones. No personal items other than clothing. No concrete evidence that could help them identify the victim.
There's a very big challenge here. You're not only challenged as a police officer to determine was there a crime, and if so, who committed it. The challenge is also the identification. Who is this person? You have a mystery.
Identifying the victim is crucial. Once that's done, the investigators will be able to construct probable scenarios to explain how the skull came to be on the island.
The person could have come out by themselves, by boat, died there by whatever means, and the boat floated away or whatever. Or somebody could have brought the individual out there and maybe killed the person there. Or a body could have floated up there out of the water. There were all those possible scenarios, and you can't dismiss one or the other so early in the case.
Moira McLaughlin tackles the job of examining the bones to try and build a biological profile of the victim, a kind of preliminary sketch for the police. She starts by delicately cleaning the bones, just enough so that she will not miss any clues, like the marks of trauma that might point to a murder.
I'm always quite careful about how much cleaning there should be, especially bones that I know have been immersed in water for a while, because bones can soften if they're in water for a long period of time. So judicious cleaning, laying it out in anatomical order, and then doing an inventory of the remains.
Investigators ask her to determine if the skeleton is male or female.
None of these determinations are 100% because the traits that we use for determining sex appear at puberty and develop during puberty, and there have been cases where there has been such an imbalance in the hormones that somebody who was actually biologically a female skeletally looked to be a male. We were fortunate in this regard to have the pelvis. So all of the traits pointed clearly towards it being a female.
McLaughlin compares the skeleton's measurements to standard human growth patterns to determine how old the woman may have been.
So in adult skeletons and skeletons that have completed their growth, we tend to find ages in decades or even in 20 years, to say somebody is between 40 and 60, for example. In this particular case, there was just an indication that this individual was at the end of their skeletal growth. And so we were able to say that we could put the skeleton in the area of early to mid-20s.
The next thing to determine is the woman's racial background. This is done by measuring the size and shape of the skull, particularly around the eyes and nose. Identifying race from skeletal remains is not an exact science. Nonetheless, after taking dozens of measurements, Moira McLaughlin arrives at a conclusion.
In the first analysis, the morphological traits pointed towards this individual being Caucasian.
The examination of the skeleton has revealed one particular feature of the victim that should make it much easier to identify her.
The left humerus, that is the upper arm bone, was smaller both in length and in thickness than the right humerus. It would have been noticeable in the individual, and in fact probably would have reduced the ability of that individual to use their arm. Every indication was that she was probably born with it, that it was a genetic abnormality.
Police used the information collected by McLaughlin to produce an identification record for the victim. Then she'll be added to the missing persons database. Not only is she added to the database, but she is compared to all the other women who have been reported missing in the country. Dave Brown can use these characteristics to shine new light on the local investigation. Leads slowly begin to come in that may help identify this woman with no name. Dave Brown gets calls from investigators in New Brunswick, Quebec, and Maine. Investigators now look at the woman's teeth for more clues to her identity. Dr. David Sweet is a forensic odontologist. He will examine the teeth that have remained in the skull and create a profile. It can be used much like a fingerprint to help identify someone.
We do an examination of the person's teeth and we produce a dental record, much the way a dentist would in a private practice.
This dental profile of the victim can be compared to the dental record of a missing person.
There's no national database for missing persons' dental records. That would be very helpful, but it's not present. And so instead, what we use is circumstantial evidence found at the scene of the crime. There may be some clue that leads us to believe that this certain person is the one that's dead. Then we can go to their medical record, their dental record, and we can obtain from their dentist any records that might be useful to compare to the teeth that are present in the victim's body to see if those records match.
Dr. Sweet can only make a partial report because he only has the upper jaw. But he observes that the victim has had intensive dental care to correct major problems with her teeth, and that her front teeth protruded. Dave Brown looks at the clothing found during the search of the island. Although the black jeans and white blouse are in poor condition, they will produce some facts.
There was very little left of the blouse and the jeans. They were mostly rotted. But we were able to find the labels. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and that's getting back to where's the person from, is there any clue that is going to help us, was to look to determine where were these bought? Are these something that are available everywhere? Are they even Canadian?
The Canadian Garment Association refers Brown to a number of manufacturers and retailers. He systematically contacts each one. It's a slow job that requires patience and perseverance.
Through many attempts and photographs that were sent to them, I was able to determine that the blouse was made by a Montreal company. And it was only out to one chain of stores, which was a Bargain Harold's stores. And I was able to determine when they were shipped and at what time. And it was actually only a 2-month period that those blouses were shipped out to the Bargain Heralds. So therefore that gave me some idea of, okay, does that person live around those areas that have Bargain Heralds? So it's a way of just narrowing down the search somewhat.
Moira McLaughlin once again examines the bones. This time, she will try to determine a cause of death. Even without organs and tissue, the bones can reveal many clues. McLaughlin looks for signs of trauma, healed fractures, and even teeth marks that may have been left by a predator.
I was also looking for evidence of perimortem trauma. Bone breaks in different ways. If the bone is fresh and it still has all the fat and water in it, it will break, it will bend, it will respond in a very different way than if the bone is dry and it has been out on the surface for a long period of time and all the fat and water is gone from it. So I should be able to tell the difference between a fresh bone response and dry bone response. And if it's fresh bone and it shows no sign of healing, that's what we refer to as perimortem.
McLaughlin notices marks on some of the ribs. She can't be certain if these marks were caused by the teeth of an animal like a coyote or by the point of a weapon like a knife. Was it suicide, an accident, or homicide? The cause of death remains a mystery. The results of her examination are inconclusive. Years in the river have done a good job of blurring the facts. Damage caused by the water continues to keep the woman's identity a secret. The forensic lab has completed the analysis of the hair. Will the results prove the hair is from the victim or a predatory animal? It's been a year since the skeletal remains have been recovered from Gilbert Island in the St. John River. The investigators have established that the victim was a white woman in her 20s with an underdeveloped left arm and an overbite. Her identity remains a mystery. Hair analysis from a sample recovered from the island shows some positive results.
They were able to tell me actually quite a lot from that particular hair. When it was examined and straightened out, it turned out to be 35 centimeters long. They were able to tell me the color was enhanced with a dye. It had been worn in a ponytail style because there was an elastic that had metal threads wrapped around it, and that metal had rusted away, but the rust marks remained 20 centimeters down on the ponytail.
Despite this information, they still don't know what the victim looks like. A sketch would allow them to ask the public for help. But without the lower jawbone, creating a composite drawing is nearly impossible.
That's a big facial feature, and it really determines what someone looks like. Do they have a small jaw? Do they have a big jaw? Do they have a long face, a round face? So that was a key element that we didn't have. How can we do a facial reconstruction? At the time, there was also the computer regeneration program that was being developed in Toronto.
Dave Brown asked the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Ontario to create a composite drawing based on the information collected. A few weeks later, Brown is transferred to another province. RCMP investigator Philip Uhl takes over the case. He knows it will not be easy. He starts by coordinating another search of the island.
I was hoping to find that lower mandible. We don't have much to go on. We were left with not knowing who this person is, where she came from, and also how did she come to be on that island.
For 2 days, a team of 30 people conduct a large-scale operation. They search the island with a fine-tooth comb.
Each square inch, each blade was turned over, and we found some small bones, several, but we did not find the part we were looking for, the lower mandible.
Moira McLaughlin tries to determine how the skeleton got onto the island.
We couldn't figure out how the skull got there without understanding the river movements and the water movements. And that's one of the things I have to do as a forensic anthropologist, is do what we call taphonomy. Everything that happens to a body from the moment the individual dies until it's found. And that could include water movements, movements of the current, the flood movements in the spring, what the vegetation is like. Has there been any human intervention? Were there any scavengers? So part of this taphonomic analysis was learning about the river.
McLaughlin studies the flooding water levels of the St. John River. She believes the body could have traveled from as far as Fredericton, over 20 kilometers away. As the spring flood subsided, the body could have become hung up on the island. As it decomposes, it would naturally disarticulate and could become scattered by predators. Moira McLaughlin's taphonomic study will also answer other questions.
We also had to know about temperature, because the temperature of the water affects decomposition. I want to try to figure out how long the person has been dead. How long does it take for a body to become completely skeletonized?
In winter, the water temperature of the river is around 0 degrees. In summer, it can get as warm as 18 degrees. McLaughlin estimates that the body has spent between 1 and 2 years at the mercy of the water. During this time, the body is battered by the currents and pulled back and forth by the tides. The face, arms, hands, and knees have been torn as they were dragged over the rocks. After a few months in the water, it decomposed and would naturally disarticulate. The skin would gradually come off the body in shreds. The Fredericton RCMP received the composite drawing done by the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Ontario. Moira McLaughlin feels that even though the sketch is based on photos of the skull, it's not a good match and should not be used for a public release. Philip Uhl decides to take the skull and bones to Toronto and create a new composite drawing. McLaughlin begins to doubt her conclusions regarding the victim's race. She takes advantage of the fact that the bones are in Toronto to ask another forensic anthropologist to examine them and to confirm whether or not the victim was Caucasian. The center takes a strong interest in this mysterious case and offers to do a diatom test as well to try and determine whether the victim had drowned. Diatoms are microscopic algae that are found in all bodies of fresh water, such as lakes and rivers. When a person drowns, the diatoms swallowed with the water are collected in the bone marrow, particularly in the femur. Because of the age and condition of the bone samples, the results don't conclude that the victim drowned. Philip Uhl turns to the Canadian Police Information Centre.
I made a request of every case available for the maritime area of missing persons, and there was 300 names that came up. And you have to manually go through this and review them.
Uhl receives the new composite drawing based on the victim's skull. It seems to confirm that the victim is Caucasian. For the very first time, the police organize a press release. The composite drawing is published in newspapers throughout the Maritimes and also in Maine and Quebec. The police receive a few leads. They compare them with Jane Doe's dental profile, but they don't correspond to the records of any missing persons. The case is reclassified as a major unsolved crime. Once a week, the police update the file. But as weeks and months go by, no new elements are added. Another year passes. The Major Crimes Unit investigators enlist the help of Michel Fournier. He is one of the best forensic artists in the country. They ask him to do a facial reconstruction of the victim.
Bien évident, quand on arrive à cette étape-ci.
Obviously, when you get to the point of having someone do a facial reconstruction of a deceased person, it's because all the other parts of the investigation have come up empty. Trying to identify the person through fingerprints or dental records or physical descriptions, they've all drawn a blank. So you've almost reached the end of the road.
Michel Fournier has just returned from the FBI Academy. He's been studying a brand new identification technique, three-dimensional reconstruction.
Comme premier cas, c'était assez.
As a first case, it was a pretty complicated one because the skull wasn't complete. If you take away the lower jaw and most of someone's teeth, that will change the shape of their face. So that made my job a little more complicated because I had to do a projection of the jaw. As a general rule, it's not something you do randomly. You take account of what you already know. So, for example, even though the teeth were missing, we could use the roots to determine the projection of the teeth.
For facial reconstruction, the artist uses 23 markers. These are points on the skull that indicate what the minimum and maximum thickness of the tissue is. The placement of the markers is the first in a long series of steps that requires time, skill, and painstaking work. The muscles, tendons, and fat on the face take shape. Up to this point, the work has been purely scientific.
The final touch is the artistic touch that gives some life to the facial reconstruction.
The final touch to complete the reconstruction is the hair. The investigators call on an expert wig maker. They've also bought a white blouse like the one Jane Doe was wearing to make the drawing as authentic as possible. It's a revelation for Philip Uhl.
It cried out. It was a person, not just a skull. And based on that, I was enthusiastic that this may come to a successful conclusion by identifying this person, who she was, what was her history, how did she come to be on the island.
Investigators expect a lot more from this more human and lifelike reconstruction. Days and then weeks go by, and no one calls. It's a hard blow for the investigation.
Dejected that I wasn't able to identify this person. But again, for some reason, the public wasn't coming forward.
Now it's Philip Uhl's turn to be transferred. He is reassigned to Ottawa. The Jane Doe case is still open, but it seems doomed to become a cold case. Strange circumstances bring a new player to the case. He will restart the investigation from square one, breathe new life into it, and send it into the newspaper, radio, and television headlines, this time with a new hypothesis. It has been over 10 years since a human skeleton was discovered on Gilbert Island in the St. John River in New Brunswick. 2 successive lead investigators have worked on the case. Now a third will try to solve the mystery of the woman with no name. RCMP analyst Gilles Blin is a specialist in VICLAS, the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System. He is attracted by the challenge and asks for the file.
I went through the box. I went through every piece of paper and every statement and every photograph in the box. remembering that the case had not been solved, or we didn't know the identity of the person or what happened to the victim, and I wanted to keep an open mind. I was puzzled for the fact that this victim was found near a large center, had a smaller left arm, a female, and we had a description of her clothes. We knew where the clothes were even bought, and yet it remained unsolved. I found that very intriguing.
Why have all the efforts to identify the victim failed over the last 10 years? Gilles Blin tries to find an explanation.
There was a couple of possibilities. A, that the person was never reported missing. 2, she was from another country. She could have been from the United States, but we checked that as well. So now if she was missing from, for example, Germany or Europe, we would check with Interpol to see if they had a person reported missing matching the description of this victim. So what I did is I took her poster or her photo, and I had that by my desk all the time. And some people might think this is corny, but I felt throughout all of this that she was guiding me through the process here, and I felt that eventually I was going to get an identity.
Gilles Blin calls a meeting with Moira McLaughlin and Michelle Fournier. He asks them to go back to square one, nearly 10 years later.
There's a new energy. We're gonna formulate a new plan. We're gonna start investigating this case and see if we can't resolve it.
Blin has an advantage over his predecessors. Forensic science has progressed dramatically in the past 10 years. Today, there are completely new, effective techniques like DNA analysis.
The first one was DNA. That's the big one. We didn't have that in 1992. The best source of DNA, if you have a skeletal remain, is a tooth.
Gilles Blin sends the skull to the Bold Lab at the University of British Columbia. He hopes they can extract DNA from the teeth, despite the fact that they have spent many years in the waters of the St. John River.
The teeth, because of the armor coating, can protect the DNA over a period of time from the influence of water. When we received the skull, I selected 2 teeth that I thought would be important sources of DNA evidence. We extracted them and crushed them using liquid nitrogen and a machine called a freezer mill. We take the whole tooth and decontaminate the outside surface using special chemicals that will destroy DNA. But then we put it into a closed system, so none of the DNA from the tooth can escape, but more importantly, no DNA from a person who's analyzing the sample or any other source can get access inside that area. So now we know that when the DNA result comes in the end, we've got that from the tooth and from nothing else.
Dr. Sweet is able to create a DNA profile of the victim. It's a huge step, but it means nothing if they don't have a family member to compare the results with.
Forensic analysis is a comparison between 2 samples. And many people believe that when you have a body or when you can collect a sample from a body, you can solve the crime. In fact, you might be able to obtain a DNA profile, but it doesn't actually solve the crime until you come up with a suspicion who that person is, and then you can compare a known sample that's taken from them to be sure that you've identified the person.
The identity of the woman with no name remains a mystery. But Gilles Blin believes that the science had taken them down the wrong track with regard to the victim's race.
I've worked in this area for several years, and I've worked with First Nations people on numerous occasions. As a matter of fact, there's several First Nations community in the area that I patrolled, and there is no specific reason why I can say this, but my feeling, and right deep in my heart, I felt she was from First Nations. Looking at her, the reconstruction Michelle had made, it's a strong feeling that I had that she was a First Nations person.
When he shares his intuitions about the victim's Aboriginal background with Moira McLaughlin, she brings him back to the scientific reality.
During the whole course of this investigation, two other physical anthropologists independently had an opportunity to analyze the remains, and all of them saw the same morphology in the cranium, and that is a morphology that's indicative of Caucasian.
Blinn is persistent, and McLaughlin agrees to completely revisit her analysis of the victim's race.
I went back over the bones again. New eyes, fresh eyes, after several years. A lot more experience, many more cases. New methods had appeared, particularly in the microscopic area. A new system called 4-disc had been developed, a computer database.
This software will give her a new biological profile to compare with a database of skeletal measurements of modern humans.
The person was a living human being at one point. She had a life. She had parents, perhaps people that loved her, perhaps children. And, you know, it's sad that someone met her fate and floated down a river by herself and stayed there for 2 years. It's a terrible story. And I felt really sad for this victim.
As long as the victim remains unidentified, the investigators cannot begin to explore the probable causes of her death. Will McLaughlin's new analysis prove Gilles Blinn's hypothesis is correct? Over a year has passed since Gilles Blinn reopened a 10-year-old Jane Doe cold case. Dr. David Sweet has created a genetic profile of the victim. Moira McLaughlin has reanalyzed the skeleton using new techniques in order to, once again, confirm the victim's race. The results from the 4-disc software arrive, and much to Gilles Blinn's frustration, they again suggest the victim was Caucasian. Moira McLaughlin doesn't know what to think.
How can we look at this? I mean, here on the one hand, I've got the science telling me that it's a Caucasian female, and we should be able to, in a small area like the Maritimes, find her. And we thought about the fact that, that in the Atlantic provinces, for over 400 years, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Europeans have been living intimately with each other, marrying, raising families together, and sort of collectively as a group, we said, let's broaden it. Let's broaden this biological profile and open it up. Let's look at her ancestry being Mi'kmaq or Maliseet, and that was the starting point.
With a new approach, Gilles Blinn does another search in the Canadian Police Information Centre database. He searches from 1991 to 2001, and this time he includes people of Aboriginal origin.
There was in excess of 5,000 missing females. I think I had 300 and odd pages of missing women on those printouts, so I had quite a few to go through. But you gotta remember, not all of them are victims of foul play. Some of them are missing for some odd reasons, runaways and so on. There's a great number that are missing due to foul play, but not all.
Months of laborious work yield nothing. 5,000 missing women are checked, and 5,000 are ruled out.
The conclusion was there was no match. Simple. I looked at them and then looked at them and looked at them again in the hopes of finding a match. And I didn't find any.
Gilles Blinn decides to call on the media throughout the country. One of the largest television networks in Canada agrees to do a special report on the reopening of the case.
Well, two things can happen. Number one, we're gonna get a lot of tips and it's gonna keep me busy for a long time. Or number two, we're not gonna get any tips at all.
Thousands of posters are printed and sent to all the police agencies across Canada and the northeastern United States. Gilles Blinn also contacts police forces overseas. Days turn into weeks and weeks into months. And once again, there is nothing but false leads.
Thinking back, I had a lot of tips, but they were all vague tips. They didn't pan out. I was asked numerous times, do you get discouraged when a lead doesn't pan out? I said, no, I don't get discouraged, I just get more determined.
That year, the fall in Fredericton is dreary and wet. Many people find the atmosphere depressing. The suicide rate hits an all-time high.
There was a rash of homeless people from the city throwing themselves in the river to commit suicide. Those events triggered these thoughts that had I want to say a light bulb came on, or I had an idea. There's a local soup kitchen where homeless people that are down under luck, they go and they have their meals, and that was the first place I went.
Blaine hopes that someone will remember her. He calls the manager, George Pierce. Pierce has an excellent memory. He remembers a strange, solitary woman who regularly came to the soup kitchen in the 1980s. He says the drawing is not quite right. Her face was rounder, more wrinkled. He also remembers that the woman had one arm that was shorter than the other. It was her left arm.
I felt good about it. I thought, okay, we're on the right track. I felt that was the first solid lead we had in several years.
Pierce told him something else. The woman always had a pair of very long scissors. She seemed to carry them for self-defense. George Pierce can still clearly remember the last time he saw her. It was in September of 1990. She was hitchhiking next to the highway. Since he was driving in the opposite direction, he didn't stop. After that, he often wondered what had happened to her. Gilbert calls the forensic artist, Michel Fournier. He says he would like to modify the drawing of the woman. George Pierce explains that the lower part of her face was fuller and that she had buck teeth. And more importantly, that the skin on her cheeks and neck were more wrinkled. With this new sketch, Gilbert again notifies the media about the case. In a very short time, the police receive a phone call from the owner of an old building downtown. He believes he recognizes the woman they are looking for. Gilbert pays him a visit.
He had not seen this person for several years, and he didn't know where she was. And by viewing the composite drawing, he felt that perhaps this person was the victim that was found on the island.
She was a solitary, quiet woman who lived on social assistance. He said she never cashed her last check. The owner remembers her name and knows where her parents live.
And Constable Cole followed up on that, met with family members, and obtained some genetic material for DNA testing, and a match occurred, and the victim was identified.
The victim was in fact Aboriginal. Her parents, who lived on a reserve a few kilometers from Fredericton, had never reported her missing. They thought that she had simply left and hoped that someday she would return.
I knew we were going to find something. I knew that it was going to be important, and that these eagles were connected in some way with that individual. And as it turned out, they were important birds to this woman too, in her cultural life. So whether they were looking after her, whether they were bringing us there, I don't know, but for me there's a connection. And I'm glad they were there. Yeah.
I can't explain the feeling it is when the victim, all of a sudden we know who it is, we're able to bring that victim home. Now spiritually, that victim is now able to rest in peace.
Gilles Blin has finally put a name to a decade-old case file. Out of respect for her family, we will leave her secret in the waters of the St. John River. Source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. In a suburb of Montreal, Quebec, a cunning and perverted criminal uses water to destroy every trace of his crime. For months, investigators try to focus an enormous number of leads. May 2002. Jessica Grimard did not come home last night. Her parents are distressed that their 14-year-old daughter has not even called. Her father hopes that Jessica spent the night at a friend's. He calls to try and track her down, but no one knows where she is.
At the same time, he had a kind of premonition that his daughter was near the water. Not far from where the family lives, in Rivière des Prairies, there's a stream. The father decided to walk to the stream to see if there were any signs of his daughter there.
Jessica's father searches a park across the street from their home. The stream is swollen by the spring rains.
In his mind, the father could see the water and his daughter close to the water. But you don't just think, okay, I'm gonna solve a crime.
Within minutes, Jessica's father finds a shoe, then the horrifying discovery of his daughter, lifeless. Detective Sergeant Joanne Barabé is with the Montreal Police Major Crimes Unit. She's the lead investigator.
I knew that she had been stabbed and her throat cut, and that the father had discovered his daughter's body.
Forensic technician Francis Gotier will assist Barabé to gather evidence from the scene.
What I remember from the day is that it was raining heavily as I headed to the scene. I knew the scene was outdoors, and I was thinking, oh my God, what will this scene be like?
They know the water will seriously complicate the investigation. Recent rain may have erased footprints, washed away bloodstains, and destroyed DNA evidence. Investigators start at the outside of the scene and work their way in toward the victim. The first thing they need to determine is the entry point.
It's an outdoor scene, which is more difficult. It's harder to tell where they came from. There are no entrance or exit doors. They could have come from anywhere. So we spent time looking at any openings we could see into the forest.
The next step for Joanne Barabé and Francis Gotier is to approach the victim, concentrating on what they can find all around her.
As I was crossing the forest, I saw the victim in the stream. I had a flash. I felt a sudden flush of horror, and I had to talk myself through it. To create an emotional barrier, because you can't let your emotions get the better of you. So I put my feelings totally to one side.
Gignac gathers evidence around the stream. What could the water be hiding, and what has it washed away? After a detailed examination of the crime scene, they turn their attention to the victim.
Donc, on pénètre dans l'eau pour vérifier la victime, pour
We
examiner.
went into the water to examine the victim, but without touching her, just going over her visually to look for anything noteworthy.
S'il y a des choses de particulier.
They confirm that the victim's throat has been cut.
Elle s'était vidée de son sang, elle était blanche, et puis la
All her blood had drained out of her.
très, très apparente.
She was white and the wound was very apparent.
Plusieurs coupures,
There were several cuts through to the spinal column,
c'était très
so it was very apparent.
il n'y avait pas tellement de sang.
There wasn't much blood near the victim's body. She was in the water, so the waves were gently lapping her.
C'est comme si la
It was as if the victim had been given a thorough wash.
elle était là,
She was in the water, and the water was doing its job.
While examining her clothing, they make a strange discovery.
Oh, ce qui me tracasse,
The thing that was bothering me was that the victim had the leaf from a tree under her third sweater.
elle est habillée,
But she was dressed when she was in the stream.
elle est dans le ruisseau.
So how did the leaf get there?
C'est ramassé là de quelle façon?
Joanne Berube suspects the victim was undressed and then her clothes were put back on.
Donc, je me dis, il y a une possibilité d'agression sexuelle.
There is the possibility of a sexual assault, which for now I can neither confirm nor rule out. But at the moment, the only clue I have is the leaf. And that leads me to believe that something might have happened.
She's in the water, but did she die in the water? Could it have happened out of the water? That was the other thing we wanted to know.
The procedure for gathering evidence on land is straightforward. But for evidence found in the water, the rules are different.
Sur cette scène-là, je sais qu'elle a les mains dans l'eau. Donc, avant que le médecin...
At this scene, I knew the victim had her hands in the water. So before the coroner moved her, I decided to put plastic bags on her hands to protect them, in case there were things in her hands or under her nails.
Dans les mains. Ou sous les ongles.
The investigators find bloodstains on branches and leaves. This indicates that the attack must have started on land. But what happened after that? Was there a struggle? Did she try to run and fall into the stream? Or did the perpetrator drag her there to wash away the evidence? Detective Sergeant Gilles Lafrance from the Major Crimes Unit interviews Jessica's father.
You can't fully enter into the grieving process right away because you have to provide information. You've just lost a loved one, a child, a sister, but for now you have to focus on remembering things. Who are her friends? Where was she going last night? What time was she supposed to come home? Who was she with?
Lafrance learns that Jessica's grandmother lives nearby. She saw a beige car parked on the street and a strange man got out and walked away. When she looked out before going to bed, the car was gone. Berube and Gignac have not found a weapon, a footprint, or a fiber that will lead them to a possible murderer. They'll continue their investigation the next day. Mario Arbor of the emergency response team is called in to assist. The investigators ask him to search the stream for a murder weapon.
We explained to them exactly what kind of equipment we had, including a metal detector. They wanted to know whether we could use it to look for metal in the water as well as on dry land. And it can be used in the water.
He is aware that the investigators have high hopes that his search will lead them to a murder weapon. He also knows that searching in water presents special problems.
If we start moving our hands around in the water with all the leaves and rocks, and we accidentally touch the tool or weapon, it can be devastating for the investigation.
Joanne Berube and Francis Gignac begin to uncover some fresh evidence.
Some blood had collected under the leaves, and because they were so wet, it hadn't had time to dry out.
Berube believes this is where the victim's throat was cut. Mario Arbor arrives at the stream and begins to look for a murder weapon.
What could the person responsible for this crime have done afterwards? Could they have been nervous and run away immediately, leaving the knife at the scene? Or did they take the time to clean it, hold it tightly, and keep it on them? Or did they just go and hide it somewhere nearby, in the water, on the shore, or in the bush? Or after committing the crime, did they throw it as far away as they could? It's as if you're trying to get into the killer's head. You're trying to figure out what he might have been thinking, how he might have reacted. If I were him, what would I do with the stream here?
The investigation requires patience and attention to detail.
Working in the water is different from working on land, because when you look in the water, the image is refracted. And if you put your hand in the water, it creates ripples, so you could lose sight of whatever you thought was there.
Gignac and Berube continue to make progress.
We also discovered a second earring that was deeper among the leaves. Had it been torn out by the suspect? Can we find DNA from the suspect on it? That's the important thing for an investigator.
Each new discovery raises new questions.
At the scene, you can assume anything. It's a man, it's a woman. Here we have a 14-year-old girl who has been found dead. Was it jealousy? It could be a man or a woman. All these things were going through our minds.
After several hours, Mario Arbor has to admit defeat.
We found nothing at all that we could say must have belonged to the suspect. That made us think that the person must not have been nervous and must have been aware of what they were doing, and that they may have carefully kept the murder weapon with them.
After 2 days, there is still no evidence leading them to a murderer. Joanne Berube reviews the autopsy results with Gilles Lafrance.
La victime a 25 plaies, dont 9 plaies de défense.
The victim has 25 wounds, including 9 defense wounds. She has been stabbed on the body, and her throat has been cut very deeply, with extreme violence. The wounds are very deep. I asked him whether she'd been sexually assaulted, but the pathologist had told me that there was no evidence of sexual assault.
Berube can't stop thinking about the leaf she found on Jessica's body. She calls the medical examiner to tell him about her suspicions. Since there is no trace of semen, the coroner cannot confirm nor rule out the possibility of rape. Francis Gignac prepares all the exhibits to send to the forensic lab. She hopes that the scientists will be able to find traces of DNA and that the water hasn't contaminated the samples. The community is in shock. Nearly 1,000 people attend Jessica's funeral to express their sympathy to the family and friends. Others hold a quiet vigil in the forest. somewhere in town the murderer is hiding. The investigators continue their work in the neighborhood. They've received more than 30 leads. Each one has to be thoroughly explored. Joanne Berube wants to know everything about Jessica. She interviews the family, neighbors, friends, schoolmates and teachers, everyone in her social circle.
Plusieurs pistes en même temps.
We were considering a number of possibilities. Should we be looking at her friends? Could it be a revenge after some kind of quarrel? Was it a love triangle? Even young people can react differently sometimes.
The investigators learned that Jessica was a good student. She got along well with all the kids at school. She was always willing to help them. She was starting to get interested in boys, but she wasn't known to have a boyfriend. No one seemed to be jealous of her or want to get revenge. She was always with her parents, sisters, or friends. She never went anywhere alone. There was nothing suspicious about Jessica.
What I learned about the girl was that there was nothing at all that could move the investigation forward. Nothing that could explain how she came to be where she was found. Nothing that could help us. No clues, absolutely nothing.
The investigators widened their search.
In the area where she was found, there are 3 centers where there are people who have been released, either from prison, from a detention center, or from an institution.
Berube checks all the individuals released from custody during the months preceding the crime and finds no one. She also checks all the incident reports involving a beige vehicle during the week of the crime, and once again, nothing. All the forensic reports have been returned, and no leads are produced.
Unfortunately, no DNA was found on the scene, and the victim didn't have any traces of DNA on her. No detail had been left. When we were at the scene, we were thinking, it's either someone close to her who really had it in for her, or we are dealing with a murderer who was obviously killed before. And if we're looking for a serial killer, we really, really want to find that person. Because if this isn't their first murder, it won't be their last either.
5 months pass and the police have hit a dead end. They have no DNA, no fingerprints, no motive. They've run out of leads. It takes a remarkable series of events for the investigators to discover a connection, one that will bring them into contact with the diabolical criminal. A 14-year-old girl named Jessica Grimard is found fully clothed with her throat cut in a small stream in suburban Montreal. The murderer is still at large, convinced that water has washed away the evidence of his crime. Locked away in a Quebec prison is one of the worst sexual predators in the country's history, a dangerous offender who has been sentenced to life. During a routine check, a security officer opens the mail sent to the prisoner. In an envelope addressed to that cell, he finds a pornographic photo of a very young girl. As a result of the photo, the agent requests special authorization to read all the mail that goes in and out of that inmate's cell. For 6 weeks, all the mail going in and out of the prisoner's cell is photocopied before being delivered. Jennifer Colomb, an analyst with the Sexual Assault Unit, examines dozens of perverted letters. She tries to establish a chronology and connections between the depraved stories.
There was a lot of things that were written that weren't real. They never happened because the letters were written to entertain. My goal in this was to take the letters, see if it mentioned a crime, and see if I could link that crime to one that was reported to the police department.
The letters are always signed with the name Frank or Frankie.
But when there was a crime committed, he used another alias. He talked in the third person. So he would write stuff like Bob's Adventure. So all of a sudden, Frankie became Bob for the crime and then became Frankie again.
Among all the horrifying letters, she comes across an account of a sexual assault that gives the name of the victim. It's the only letter in which the victim is identified, a young woman in her 20s. Jennifer Colomb recognizes the name and notifies her superiors. The lead investigator in charge of this case is Serge Richard with the Sexual Assault Unit in Montreal.
In July 2002, I was informed about a sexual assault charge, a young woman in Rivière-des-Prairies who had managed to escape from her attacker. She had told the police that she was waiting for a bus. It was raining. Someone came to the bus stop and started talking to her. They chatted, talked about the weather, and the person offered her a ride. He said, "I have a vehicle not too far from here." When they came to his vehicle, he opened the door politely, and she got in and sat down. He touched her breasts and thighs, and she managed to escape while he was trying to tie her up. She managed to bite him and open the door and run, leaving her belongings in the vehicle. We had a description of a pale-colored American vehicle. We had the height, weight, age, and physical description, but not enough to make a composite sketch.
Not only does the letter give Serge Richard the date and location of the attack, but it also has a return address on the envelope.
So that morning, I went to the commercial address. I started going through the area looking for a pale-colored American vehicle.
From the license plate, he traces the identity of the owner, Angelo Collaleo. Richard finds that Collaleo is a cell phone dealer with a long criminal record that includes several violent sexual assaults. The young woman is asked to come in and try to identify her attacker from a photo lineup.
It was positive. She recognized the person we had identified from the license plate, which was Angelo Collaleo. She recognized him from the photo lineup. That was her attacker.
Serge Richard requests an arrest warrant and 9 search warrants. While he waits for authorization, he puts Collaleo under surveillance. He doesn't want him to slip away. Mario Arbor is given the task of following him. He knows that Collaleo has been incarcerated several times for rape and that he may be armed. Collaleo seems to be on edge.
We wanted to be sure we didn't lose him. We wanted to be sure that he would be arrested and that there would be no more victims.
We had the impression he was looking for a victim. He went out a lot, spent the night driving around for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, an hour. If he wanted to rest, he would just park his car, put the seat back for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then be on his way.
We were like chained dogs, just waiting to get the go-ahead. But the ones holding the chains were the investigators.
Finally, the arrest warrant arrives. The police know he could be armed and dangerous. They proceed cautiously.
I remember it as if it was yesterday. When we moved in, spotted the individual and called him. That was it. We had him.
Kalaleo is arrested for the sexual assault of the woman he picked up at the bus stop.
Calme, très calme. À un point tel que c'en était presque...
Calm, very calm. So much so that it was almost shocking. It was as if everything was fine. Everything was normal. It was quite remarkable. And even when he was handcuffed, there was no sign of nervousness, no tenseness. But he had a distant look. He looked lifeless.
The same day, the police search Kalaleo's home.
What was found at Mr. Kalaleo's home was enough to convict him. Items from the sexual assault that had taken place in July and correspondence between the dangerous offender and himself. Letters he had received. There was also a computer on which we found letters he was writing. We found a bag he'd used for committing the crimes.
Investigators know that Kalaleo attacked the young woman at the bus stop. But how many other crimes has he committed?
I interrogated Mr. Kalaleo for five and a half hours. I tried to find out more about him, his personal life, his private life, and so on. We chatted, as if I was trying to make friends with someone, and he was quite open, as we talked about all kinds of things. He had been married, no children, normal childhood, nothing out of the ordinary. He'd taken some courses and was in the cellular telephone business. An average guy that you might meet at the mall or on the street.
Richard tells him about all their discoveries, all the searches, all the people they have questioned, and that he had been under surveillance.
We didn't tell him this all at once. We gave him a little additional information from time to time, and every time we alluded to the events, he always became very pensive. Always. When we started talking about the crimes, he got even more distracted. From time to time, he seemed completely lost in space. And I remember I would snap my fingers or say, "Angelo such and such," and then he'd snap out of it. I felt as if... Have you ever seen the movie Silence of the Lambs? It was one of the longest interrogations I've ever conducted in my career. And I felt as if I was with a guy like that. It would end with, "I'll see you later. I can't talk about that. I'm too tired." It would be midnight or 1 in the morning, and he'd say, "I'm exhausted. I haven't slept. You know, you were following me. I haven't had any sleep. I'm tired."
Kalaleo refuses to cooperate, but he still feels the need to brag about his secret. While in custody, he describes his horrific deed to his cellmate. The man becomes an unexpected ally for the investigation. The lifeless body of 14-year-old Jessica Grimard has been found in a stream that flows near her family home. The investigators do not have any leads in her case. They arrest Angelo Colaleo for an unrelated sexual assault in the same part of the city.
I was called in to administer a polygraph test to a prisoner who had been charged with murder.
The prisoner tells Gilles Lafrance that his cellmate, Angelo Colaleo, has confessed to a heinous crime. He cut the throat of a young girl and left her in a stream in the Montreal suburb of Rivière-des-Prairies.
So when he told me that, since I had worked on the case of the girl who was in the same neighborhood, I thought, my God, we have our suspect and he's here in the detention center.
Joanne Barabé asks Lafrance to convince the murder suspect to be an informant and get more details from Colaleo.
And the next day, we went to see him and get more details. And to our great surprise, he gave us details from the scene of the crime that had not been mentioned before, such as the way the victim had been discovered, facts that could only have been known to the perpetrator of the crime, and to the investigators who had gone over the crime scene.
Colaleo's crimes are so depraved that even another murderer can't keep them a secret. He agrees to cooperate.
L'informateur va écrire, va prendre des notes.
At night in his cell, the informant would secretly make notes on the information he had received. He was even able to make sketches of the crime scenes and exactly how he carried out the crimes. Quite specific details. This information was sent to us week by week.
The case against Colaleo is getting stronger. Investigators must now confirm that the letters taken from his apartment match the ones sent to the dangerous offender in prison under the pen name Frank. The Quebec Provincial Police seize the mail in the dangerous offender's cell. They find over 350 letters full of sex, violence, and murder. There are nearly 30 written by Colaleo. All these letters are passed on to Jennifer Colomb. She begins the daunting task of reading over 1,500 pages of horrifying correspondence. She comes across a letter written 10 days after Jessica's murder. It describes in detail the rape and brutal murder of a young girl. A sickening letter, unbelievably sadistic and depraved.
And it started off with, "Hi, how are you? I'm fine, how's work, this and that." And then all of a sudden, the letter stops and it says, "I'm gonna tell you about something that happened, an adventure." And the adventure starts off with this guy going in his car, how he looked for somebody. It could have been anybody. What he was looking for, he knew. The type of evening it was, the description of the rain and everything else, that was part of his plan. He described extremely graphic detail, the pursuit, the chase, the hunting of a victim. And what happened was he found one. Unfortunately, he found one. I couldn't fathom that people could do this to other people and describe it in graphic detail. It was extremely disturbing to read these letters. And even when it came to the fantasies, I had trouble thinking that human beings, one human being, could do this to another. It was difficult.
Joanne Barabé is notified with a copy of the letter.
I read the letter over and over again, many times. Every detail described in the letter was verified and consistent with the crime scene.
The details in this letter could have only been known by the perpetrator of the crime and the investigators at the scene. The position of the body, the location of the wounds, the way the wounds had been inflicted, a description of the victim, and the exact time and location of the crime.
It was very difficult to read all those details. It was difficult in the sense that when you go to a scene, you only know what you see. But reading that letter, you could see the feelings of the attacker, how he was enjoying what he was doing. And he also describes the feelings and the suffering of the victim.
Kalaleo actively hunts down his prey. He writes, "I'm going to wait for her next week and see where she lives. The next day, I will try to see if there's anyone at home. If not, I'll use the flower delivery technique. Believe me, I work hard to make sure I don't leave any traces." On May 7th, 2002, Kalaleo decides to make his move. A little after 8 p.m., he spots his prey. A few hundred meters further, and she'll be safe at home. He has to intercept her calmly without frightening her. He asks her the time and strikes up a conversation.
Then he got out a knife, put it to her throat, and took her to the forest. And then he sexually assaulted her.
He brutally rapes her next to the stream. Then he promises her he will spare her life if she does what he says. He has Jessica wash away all traces of his crime.
After the sexual assault, he says to his victim, "Go and wash in the stream. I don't want anything of me left on you," even though he had worn a condom. The victim didn't want to because the water was very cold. So then he showed her the knife and said, "You don't have a choice. Go and wash."
When she walks out of the stream shivering, he lets her put her clothes back on.
That was when he cut her throat and stabbed her repeatedly. Back at home, he went to bed. He was remembering what he had done and began feeling aroused. And then he thought, there's DNA. I didn't get rid of all the DNA. So he went back to the scene. He took the victim's body and moved it around a bit to wash it.
The letter is dated May 17th, 2002, 10 days after the crime. Line after line, the murderer relives what he has done, triumphantly sharing it with his old prison mate.
He is truly a cruel, cold-blooded predator. One who knows our investigation techniques and will do anything to make sure he doesn't get caught. Even if that means going back to the crime scene twice.
Among the letters, Jennifer Colombe has found 2 other stories of rape and murder that seem very real. These stories are consistent with the deaths of 2 girls in 1993. In both cases, the murderer used fire to hide the evidence. Can Kalaleo be responsible for these deaths as well?
So I had to look at these 2 other murders that had been made to look like fires. I needed to see whether I could resume the investigations and find evidence that would match his accounts of the scenes.
The cases against Kalaleo are multiplying. It seems inevitable that he will spend the rest of his life in prison, or will he find a way to escape his fate? The serial rapist, Angelo Kalaleo, has been arrested again. He is now a suspect in 3 murders, including 14-year-old Jessica Grimard. Jessica was found by her father in a stream near their home. Jennifer Colomb believes she has found confessions to 3 murders in the letters written by Kalaleo.
In one of them, he describes his MO of how he committed a crime, of how he committed a sexual assault. And it was written as though it was written in a police report. Here is my MO. This is exactly how I do my crimes. And he described about how he gained access to a house. He described how he coerced the victim.
Kalaleo had developed a well-executed technique for capturing his victims. After gaining their confidence, pretending to be a flower delivery man, messenger, or repairman, he would ask to use the washroom.
He would use the washroom and put something in the toilet bowl to make it foam up. Then he'd say to the person, "Come have a look. There's something wrong with your toilet." Then he would draw his victim into an enclosed space. And then he would handcuff her and threaten her. He would take her to her bedroom and sexually assault her. And then he would use his own special technique. He would strangle his victim just long enough so that she was still breathing. And then he would set the house on fire. So the victim was still breathing and there were no marks.
Kalaleo had always captured his victims in a controlled place, inside their homes or in his car, places where he would be sure that he could wash away every bit of evidence. Jessica's murder was the first time in his psychotic career that he deviated from his strategy. Kalaleo confessed his secret to the cellmate in jail. He was haunted by the fear of leaving traces next to the stream. Joanne Berube has gathered evidence to charge Angelo Kalaleo in 3 cases, including the murder of Jessica Grimard. Crown Prosecutor Louis Bouthier will take the case to trial. He is faced with a tough opponent.
Kalaleo was careful because he had already been convicted. He'd already been given long prison sentences. In his letters, he says that he has been careless in the past, but he will not make that mistake again. So, he said, in graphic terms, that he would not let another victim get away from him if they could identify him.
Bouthier believes he has overwhelming evidence. The detailed confessions made by Kalaleo to the informant and the explicit descriptions he wrote in the letters can both be used to convict him.
It is often said that in a criminal trial there is one witness who is very important. But in this case, our important witness was the letters Kalaleo had sent to the individual incarcerated in Port Cartier.
Kalaleo's lawyer objects to the admissibility of the letters. They are so explicit and pornographic that they will likely sway the jury. As well, Kalaleo gives vulgar details about the crimes he wants to commit in the future, which are not admissible.
I will spare you the details, but they were absolutely horrifying. Things involving young children and their parents. Unimaginably violent. Often ending with the death of the young victim.
In his letters, Kalaleo also talks about his ultimate dream.
And his dream is to be out, to help his buddy escape from prison, find a house and bring victims to that house to gratify their depraved appetites. When he talked about that, he compared himself to another famous psychopath, Paul Bernardo.
The preliminary hearing begins for the 3 counts of murder. Kalaleo appears before the court.
The image he projected was of the guy next door, a very average, ordinary guy you wouldn't have noticed on the street.
The trial date is set for January 9th. The families of the victims have prepared themselves to relive their ordeal. All the media in Quebec are prepared to give it maximum coverage. But 2 days before trial, Colaleo is found lifeless in his prison cell. It is a hard blow for the Crown, and a completely unexpected one.
We were to start jury selection on Monday at 9:30, and I was notified of Mr. Colaleo's death at 9:20, 10 minutes beforehand.
Colaleo died of a drug overdose. Some people are happy that Colaleo's suicide was a self-inflicted death penalty. Others think he was too cowardly to stand trial. Colaleo used water to cover up a nearly perfect crime, but his arrogant admissions were his downfall. He gave investigators the evidence they needed to beat him at his own game. Source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. One of the most chilling cases in Canadian history. The victim and the perpetrators are all teenagers, between 13 and 16 years old, and all but one are girls. A crime so violent, it sent shockwaves through Victoria, the peaceful capital of British Columbia, and made headlines around the world. Rena Verk, who has been living in a foster home, was going to spend the weekend with her parents. On Friday night, a friend calls to invite her to a party by the river. Rena first says she would rather stay home, but in the end decided to go. Rena's mother is concerned for the safety of her rebellious daughter.
I don't know if I feel comfortable about this. Her mother said, "Don't go. These girls don't like you. Why would you go?" Well, I think they want to bury the hatchet. I think they want to make it right. And she agreed to meet them.
By early morning, Rena has not returned. Her mother calls the foster home, but Rena is not there either. By law, the foster home is obligated to notify police when residents miss their curfew.
For a youth to go missing on a Friday night and be reported missing, especially from a foster home, which is where this girl was at the time, is not unusual at all. Normally they return home within 72 hours.
By Monday morning, Rena is still missing. The police make inquiries at her school. In the following days, disturbing rumors begin circulating among the students.
The number one rumor was that there'd been some sort of altercation and that a young girl had gone missing or, in fact, perhaps had even been murdered.
And what made the case a little more difficult at the beginning was some of the kids had reported seeing the missing girl after she was allegedly murdered. So the information was inconsistent.
This is a young lady who had been missing before, had been reported missing before, and as a result, we believed that she would probably show up in the next couple of days like she had in the past.
Rena's parents emigrated from India. Desperate for attention, she was excluded by her peers and became estranged from her family.
Some accounts, nice girl. Other accounts, she's lied about things to do with her parents. She's lied about things to do with her friends. And she had a hard time fitting in, so she would do what she could to fit in.
Rumors circulate that she was savagely beaten by a swarm of kids and that she had died from the attack.
But there was nothing concrete. We didn't have anybody who had seen her be killed. We had nobody who had heard firsthand, because we're trying to get a feel, are we doing a missing person case here? Are we doing a homicide investigation?
Finally, the police get the lead they've been searching for. Someone identifies Chloe and Jesse and said they'd been bragging about beating Rena so badly that they broke her nose. It happens that these two girls actually live at the same foster home with Rena. The police pay them a visit and take them in for questioning. Things begin moving quickly after that.
It wasn't very long before the first girl started confessing to being involved in the assault, to what she knew about the actual murder. She didn't witness the murder, and she only had it second and third hand.
Bob Downey gets the first confession. Chloe gives him the names of all the attackers, 1 boy and 7 girls. The boy is 15 years old, and the youngest girl has only just turned 13. But one confession isn't enough. Bob Downey authorizes arrest warrants for all of the suspects. He takes charge of their interrogations.
This is not a case where you had young people breaking down and crying and getting upset, and I can recall a number of the young females who were responsible for the assault sitting in there and chatting and laughing, and I recall walking through there almost feeling disgusted. It was almost unexpected.
The police learn that these kids often meet under the Craigflower Bridge in a riverside park. The bridge is near their school, and each week they party there until late into the night. A favorite hangout hidden from the watchful eyes of adults, where the kids feel free to do anything they want.
The victim was lured to this location under the auspices of coming to a party, and you know, they set her up. They lured her there, and they were ready and had planned to beat her, and that's what they did.
On this particular night, Rena had decided to join the group under the bridge. When Rena saw Chloe arrive, she knew she wasn't invited to the party to bury the hatchet. Chloe immediately starts in on her.
One girl even had a cigarette and burned her right in the middle of the forehead, which my opinion would be that because of the victim's ethnicity, that would have been an insult to her and her customs and to her family and everyone, and I think that would have been done intentionally.
And missing girl responded with a swing back, and basically the fight was on. And then other kids started jumping in, to the point that 8 kids jumped in. They swarmed her. She had no way out. There was no way she was going to win this or escape with the mob mentality that kicked in. At that point, she had nobody in the world. There was nobody there for her. There's nobody on her side. One of our suspects finally saw that she had had enough. And this girl was tough. She was a kickboxer. She'd been in fights before, and they knew that she was a tough girl. And she made the other kids stop. She said, enough. She's had enough. Anybody else who wants to hit her is going to have to go through me. And it was good that she did that, because that assault would have carried on. They stole her bag from her, and it was almost like rats with a piece of meat.
When the swarming is over, the attackers leave Rena to her fate.
So she was mobile at that time. She was walking slow. Some describe her as staggering. She didn't talk to anybody and started walking across the bridge in an easterly direction or towards Saanich. Kids that saw her describe her face as being bruised already, bloodied nose, and like I say, staggering in her walk.
All 8 of the young attackers make a pact. They agree that Rena was last seen crossing the Craigflower Bridge. Then a twist. 6 of the kids say that Warren and Kelly broke away from the group and followed Rena. But Kelly and Warren insist that they simply went home. The contradictory statements lead the police to expand their investigation from a missing persons case to a possible homicide. police decide to focus their search in the river under the bridge. The gorge is a tidal river that flows from Victoria Harbor. It's overgrown with weeds and brush and has a strong current. The police are well aware that their search will be tough.
Well, the water. It's your enemy. It's an enemy for any kind of investigation, especially with forensics. It's both a psychological barrier for policemen and for criminals. Quite often, a criminal will dispose of something in the water thinking it's gone. No one's going to find it. I'm saying it's been thrown, quote unquote, in the ocean. Well, that's what the dive team's there for, is to remove that psychological barrier, to go down there and to find the stuff.
The dive team has determined the search area, taking into account the level of the tide on the night of the crime. The river isn't very deep, but the bottom is mud. Every step makes the water more murky. For the divers, this means visibility is almost nil. They will have to feel their way in the dark. Rick Gosling knows how hard it is to look for evidence underwater.
You do it first, quite often by touch. And from a flat, muddy surface to suddenly reaching out and touching a body can be quite emotional, quite scary. And then out of the gloom, I suppose you'd say, the body sort of blooms up on you. And the fact that the visibility is so bad, you have to be quite close to actually confirm that it is a body. Psychologically, it's very hard on a lot of divers.
They make the first discovery, a pair of girls' underwear.
Most of the items we find are on the bottom. They're not floating anymore. They're not subject to the tides. Quite often objects that sink to the bottom, even light objects, like clothing or papers or things like that, once they become waterlogged and touch the bottom, quite often they stay there.
As on dry land, every precaution has to be taken when recovering evidence underwater.
You never know what small amounts of evidence may still be just slightly clinging to the fabric. So what we try to do is, every time we seize an object underwater, we try to have a large enough bag that we can encompass it without perhaps picking it up and moving it. And in that way, we also capture some of the water that's immediately surrounding the object that may or may not contain trace evidence, hairs, fibers, things like that.
Next, the dive team finds a pair of jeans.
So at that point, we thought that we were on the right track. We had been moving in the direction that we thought a missing girl might be if she'd gone into the water at that time. We felt confident that within a short period of time, we might find her.
Hours pass, and the divers have found nothing more than the two pieces of clothing.
It was very frustrating. And we felt sure that she must be somewhere. It would have to be an extremely unusual, heavy, fast current to move a body once it's on the bottom. So we weren't sure why we weren't finding the missing girl if we'd found her clothing, unless perhaps she just wasn't there.
A week has passed, and Rena is still missing. Crown Prosecutor Stan Lowe is anxious to charge the suspects as soon as possible. But on what grounds? Will the teenagers be charged with Rena's assault or with her murder? A 14-year-old girl has been missing for a week and is now presumed dead. 1 boy and 7 girls are in custody in Victoria, British Columbia. These kids have admitted to savagely beating Rena Verk. As yet, no charges have been laid against them. The investigators continue to search for the missing girl. A Coast Guard helicopter is brought in to help with the search.
The water is very dark. It looks almost like a deep, deep gray color at that time of year. We passed over the dive team, and we're only within about 400 meters of the dive team when we'd only just really started the search, and just absolutely surprised. I looked down, and there she was. in the water. She was very, very well hidden from both the shore and from a boat on the water. However, from the helicopter position right above, it was crystal clear that she was there.
The investigators are surprised that Rena's body was not found downstream of the bridge where they had recovered her clothing. Contrary to logic, the body had drifted upstream and became snagged in the tall weeds, hiding it from sight, except from the air.
She was floating just below the surface, probably an inch or two. She was wearing a t-shirt, as I recall. But of course, nothing else. We'd found the clothing she had on, both her jeans and her underwear prior to that. So it was really just a t-shirt she was wearing.
The divers proceed with caution to avoid disturbing the muddy riverbed around the body, being careful not to destroy any trace evidence.
Obviously, the body had been in the water for a week. How much, if any, physical evidence or DNA would there be?
For the chief investigator, Bob Downey, the discovery of the body means they can now begin to build a murder case.
So finding the body, it's almost a relief. It's one less thing to do. And it sounds cold to say that, but we now have a crime scene that we have to go in and deal with it in a forensic manner. And we have a body, so that puts other investigative steps into place.
The news of the discovery sends shockwaves through Victoria. People are horrified and outraged that a group of teenagers could commit such a ruthless crime. The murder attracts worldwide attention.
It had a big impact on the city, in my opinion, because of the age of the people involved and the fact that you had a young girl who'd been murdered in the area in which she lived. And not just that, but that you had other young people, almost children. I mean, we're talking about people 13 and 14, 15 years of age, who were the suspects in this. So this wasn't a case of a pedophile or something like this, but this was, children murdering other children.
What makes this case particularly disturbing is that all the accused are teenagers. 7 out of the 8 are girls. Rena's body has been taken for an autopsy. Finding the cause of death is crucial. If she died because of the beating, there would be 8 murderers. If she drowned, there would be only 2 suspects, Warren and Kelly. Whatever the outcome, the autopsy bears witness to the extreme brutality of the attack.
What I can tell you is that the missing girl suffered significant trauma, deep tissue bruising. She had internal organs that were bruised. It was significant trauma, and it was of a crushing nature. I've seen several autopsies. I haven't seen this level of bruising take place before, short of perhaps in a car crash, that type of injury.
The results prove Rena did not die from her beating. Deep in the tissue of her lungs, the pathologist finds traces of gravel.
I attended the autopsy as the exhibit officer, and the cause of death was, she was drowned. And I believe that was indicative with the victim being forced down. It was fairly shallow water where she was drowned, and probably the last attempt to get a gasp of breath and near the bottom and sucking those small pebbles from the ocean floor into her throat.
The investigators focused their efforts on Warren. According to the testimony of the gang, he is one of the 2 kids who followed Rena on the bridge after the attack. Warren's life has been difficult. At 16, he's been living on his own for over a year. His father has moved to California, and the last time Warren saw his mother, she was dead drunk in her trailer park. Warren became fascinated by a Los Angeles gang called the Crips. They inspired him to start his own, the Crip Mafia Cartel. He would always wear white and his gang blue.
He took the investigators to the scene basically walked them through what had happened, minimizing his own involvement. More as I was there, I saw it happening. I believe he might have said he was peripherally involved in a bit of the assault.
The police begin to put pressure on Warren. They tell him that Rena's body has been pulled from the river and was nude below the waist. They suspect she had been raped, and DNA analysis would prove if it was Warren. They also explain that they are looking for fingerprints on all the evidence, in particular from the running shoes they found on the riverbank. For the first time, Warren looks off balance. He admits that he and Kelly demanded that Rena take off her jacket and shoes, and that he had picked them up. Desperate for help, Warren asks to speak to his father.
He was overheard yelling on the telephone to his father, and he swore. He said, I really fucked up. You know, it's about what he did. It's not about what happened to the missing girl. And that's, again, typical of most of these kids.
The interrogations are complicated by the Youth Criminal Justice Act. Warren is 16 and Kelly 15 at the time of the murder. Kelly simply refuses to cooperate. She declares that she had no idea what happened after Rena walked over the bridge. Even though witnesses had seen her and Warren following Rena, the police can go no further.
With the Youth Criminal Justice Act and with the Young Offenders Act of the day, once they say, I don't want to give a statement, we have to stop.
Kelly lives with her mother and stepfather, a middle-class family. In her group of peers, Kelly is the most laid back and withdrawn. Soon after her arrest, the police search Kelly's locker at school. They make some disturbing discoveries.
One thing I distinctly remember is some drawings that were seized from the school locker of the female suspect. One of them, which depicted a police officer being shot and the bullets hitting the officer and then blood spurting out.
Chloe also dreams of becoming a gangster like her hero, Al Capone. In fact, she's made a good start in that direction, which is why she has ended up in a foster home. Jessie's story is a similar one. Her mother couldn't control her violent behavior and placed her in the home with the hopes that it would calm her down. Armed with dozens of search warrants, the police look for evidence from all the suspects. They even seize the clothing they wore on the night of the attack. All these exhibits are sent to the forensic lab for analysis. The dive team returns to the crime scene, searching the riverbed for any evidence they may have overlooked.
We started coming across little things, a small address book, pens, like a pencil, a funny little eraser, and then we started coming across papers, individual leaves of paper about the size of a journal. You would have thought they would have been washed away, but they were still stuck on the bottom, and it was obvious very shortly after that that this was the missing girl's diary. That was pretty emotional.
Rena's diary is sent to the RCMP forensic lab. Maybe it holds some clues that will lead to her murderer. Rena Verk has been swarmed, savagely beaten, and drowned by a youth gang. Police search for clear motives behind such a cruel attack on a 14-year-old girl. The police dive team has just recovered Rena's personal diary in the Gorge River. The diary is sent to the RCMP forensic lab. John Kovacs, a document specialist, gets down to work. Every second counts as the water continues to dissolve the paper, dilute the ink, and wash away trace evidence.
The first and most important thing was to separate out the single pages so that any information that was visually present could be preserved and passed on to the investigator.
All evidence found in water must be bagged with the surrounding water to preserve trace evidence. In the case of paper documents, it has to be done quickly before the paper decomposes.
Paper, when created, is probably 97% water and a few fibers kicking around. As it's actually created into paper, it removes the water and the fibers are left in place. Now that the document has, in natural fact, been subjected to an environment where the moisture is there, it swells considerably and starts to break down into its component parts.
The first task is to separate the pages that have begun to bind together.
There were, in fact, areas that had been eroded. In this particular instance, almost all of it was readable text and was, in actual fact, predominantly written with a ballpoint pen, which is not a water-soluble ink. I did, in this particular instance, create a photocopy record of all the documents so that the investigator could, in actual fact, handle that with no concern as to possibly causing any kind of problem with the original document itself.
John Kovac's objective is to preserve the documents so they can establish potential links between events and people that might shed light on Rena's swarming. The police widen their search. They begin to question family and friends of the accused in order to piece together a motive for this violent attack. The investigators discover that in the 2 weeks leading up to the attack, Chloe and Jesse, Rena's roommates at the foster home, had been on the telephone a lot with Kelly.
When they were in the planning process, they had talked about bizarre things like taking her into the woods and burying her in a hole. I mean, again, this is all, what other kids have told us.
Investigators learn why Chloe and Jesse were angry with Rena. She'd stolen Chloe's address book and then phoned Chloe's friends telling them horrible lies about her. Things like Chloe had AIDS. Chloe was absolutely furious. Worse still, Rena had been flirting with Sam, Jesse's boyfriend. The girls had seen her wearing his jacket. Some even said that Rena had slept with Sam. When Jesse heard that, she screamed that she would take revenge on Rena.
Absolutely, it was payback. You can't do this to me. You can't sleep with my boyfriend. You can't take my books and call my friends and say that I'm good friends with you because you're a misfit.
But nothing gave a strong motive to Warren and Kelly to commit such a brutal act. Throughout the interrogations, Warren gives several different versions of the events. He maintains for the longest time how he'd simply headed home without having seen Rena again. But the police have an eyewitness.
What we have is an eyewitness who says a missing girl going and then 2 others going. And as we described it later on, we have 3 people going across the bridge, only 2 came back.
Warren finally admits that what the witness said was true. He really intended to go home, but Kelly asked him to stay. She said, "Come on, let's go see if Rena's okay."
Later, he told us, I knew we weren't going to see if she was okay. We were going to do her more harm.
Warren finally gives a full confession to the investigators.
The girl asked the missing girl, "Are you going to rat us out?" And she's beaten. She's beat up and she's got no means of protecting herself. And of course her answer was, "No, I'm not going to rat you out." The girl, the suspect, then said, "We're not done." They took her jacket and they took her shoes. They folded those things up and they put them off to one side. So now they started what's an upping, again, to humiliate her even further, to again show that power that they had over her. And then the boy and the girl just started beating on the missing girl. They started both of them punching and kicking. It was a horrific scene, to the point that she went unconscious. The two of them then dragged her down to the gorge waterway. On the way down, her jeans started sliding down, exposing her buttocks.
Warren says that when they arrived near the water, he saw that Kelly wanted to drag Rena into the river. He asked her 3 times to stop. But Kelly didn't. She pulled Rena into the river, deep enough to hold her head underwater, for a very long time.
Boy described seeing red foam coming to the surface from where the girl's being held under, and he would see this in the moonlight, that it was a full moon that night.
Kelly continues to deny everything. She maintained she'd simply gone back home that night, like all the others. She remembers taking a shower before going to bed. She insists that the others had decided to make her the scapegoat, but she is innocent. In the end, the diary does not offer any new clues.
I probably didn't know a lot about the victim, but formed some opinions from reading her diary. And I felt that this was a young girl growing up, wanting to be accepted, wanting to be popular, having probably difficulty in the home because of their expectations, which were normal expectations because of the value system of her parents, and her, battling against that.
Despite some limited evidence, the lawyers have their work cut out for them. They must prepare strong cases against 8 accused. 6 for aggravated assault and 2 for second-degree murder. Prosecutors decide that Warren and Kelly will be tried as adults. In Victoria, British Columbia, 8 teenagers stand trial for the beating and murder of Rena Burke. 6 young girls are charged with aggravated assault. Warren Glowatsky and Kelly Ellard are charged with murder. People around the world await the results. The assault case is airtight and should be over quickly. The prosecutors have evidence, eyewitnesses, and confessions. The girls are charged under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. They all plead guilty and are sentenced to between 6 months and a year in jail. Warren and Kelly are tried as adults. Both appeal the decisions, but the appeals are rejected. There are no witnesses to the murder. No one saw Kelly or Warren drag Rena towards the river and drown her. Crown Attorney Stan Lowe is looking for concrete evidence that will put the suspects at the scene of the crime. Could water have washed away the incriminating evidence? The first piece of evidence is the pair of jeans that Warren was wearing the night in question. Will they put him at the scene of the crime?
He was wearing white jeans. He had a girlfriend at the time. And as I mentioned, he had one of the witnesses that was sleeping over at his house. Both the girlfriend and the witness described as about a dime size or quarter size, what they thought was blood stain on his jeans. He took his jeans and his socks and he washed them. He actually asked for instructions how to bleach the spot out of his pants. When we got the jeans later on, we were able to find the mark, but we were unable to trace it back to actually being blood, and that's because of the bleach that was used. He didn't want to be tied to that at all. He knew there was evidence there, and he did everything he could to get rid of that evidence.
The next pieces of evidence are the shoes worn by the accused. Each pair is placed in individual exhibit bags. Scott Green examines the shoes at the RCMP forensic lab. He notices something strange.
What I found later was those shoes, albeit they appeared to be dry when they went in the bag, they started to sweat and water leached out of those shoes and formed in the bottom of those bags. That didn't happen with any of the other shoes that we seized. And my theory today is that those were the same shoes that those two suspects were wearing the night of the murder. They got soaking wet, and they never completely dried out.
The forensic analysis was deemed inconclusive. It was not strong enough to place them at the scene of the crime. The third piece of evidence is the pair of jeans recovered downstream of the victim. Forensic analysis found no DNA evidence to put Rena in the jeans. The fourth piece of evidence is the jacket found near the Craigflower Bridge.
The jacket had its own interesting story. It was taken from the girl, it was folded up and put down. A person coming by on a bicycle found the jacket, thought it might belong to a friend of theirs. They picked up the jacket, saw blood on the jacket, and they took it home and washed it.
The Crown Attorney knows that without concrete evidence, it will be nearly impossible to place the suspects at the scene. Although Warren has made many confessions, Kelly has denied everything. Warren goes to trial first, charged with second-degree murder. From the beginning, Warren looks vulnerable.
He looked young, small, nervous, apprehensive.
Prosecutor Stan Lowe begins with a powerful opening statement. 3 crossed the bridge. Only 2 came back. Warren admits to crossing the bridge with Kelly and catching up with Rena. It's 1 point for the Crown.
I heard a very generalized, antiseptic version of events, which shifted blame from himself towards Kelly Ellard. And he portrayed himself as a person who was trying to stop her by asking her to stop no less than 3 times. But what he did was minimize his involvement. No detail. And it was completely devoid of any descriptors of the victim during the course of the incident.
In cross-examination, Stan Lowe questions Warren about the events that night, moment by moment, but not in chronological order. He's counting on this tactic to throw Warren off balance.
He did not discuss what his motivation was, so I took him there. He spoke in general terms of the events that occurred, but I took him through each one. I queried him as to what he was thinking at the time, what was going on, what did he expect to happen? Why would he assist in taking her shoes and jacket? He didn't know. On questions that probed into his actions, which I say speak louder than words, he didn't have a reasonable answer.
The trial lasts a month. The judge delivers a lengthy judgment. Up until his final word, it's impossible to predict what the verdict will be. Guilty.
The mandatory sentence at that time was a life sentence with no eligibility for parole for 7 years.
Warren was 15 years old at the time of the crime, 17 when he was sentenced to life in prison. The lawyers believed that Warren's conviction would help with Kelly's prosecution, or so everyone thought. In fact, the crime has provoked such outrage in Victoria that Kelly's lawyers have requested that her trial be moved to Vancouver, 150 kilometers away. After 2 years of delays, Kelly Ellard finally gets her day in court. She is admitted to being part of the first beating, but to nothing more. Kelly's lawyer emphasizes that nothing puts his client at the scene of the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing. He claims, quite simply, that Warren lied. Regardless, Kelly Ellard is found guilty and sentenced. Her lawyer immediately appeals. 5 months later, Kelly is released. Catherine Murray, a colleague of Stan Lowe, has been following the trial.
The cases that I was working on were the Crip Street Gang cases when we heard about the appeal, and I immediately phoned my office and said, I really want to do that Ellard case. Stan was involved in another murder trial, and I ended up taking it. This was a horrific crime. It just terrified the people of Victoria. For prosecutors, that's just the ultimate challenge. It really matters.
While preparing herself for the trial, Catherine Murray learns that the jacket Kelly wore the night of the crime was seized during a search.
It had what looked to be dried salt stains on the jacket, almost up to where the waist would be and up the arms a little bit.
Robert Groves at the RCMP laboratory in Vancouver examines the stains on Kelly's jacket. He asks for a water sample from the river to be used for comparison.
I wanted to try to replicate what would happen if this particular garment, not a garment similar to it, but this identical garment was in contact with seawater. What happens? So the collar was dipped, the water wicked up into the fabric. You could see it gradually soak up into it. When I felt that I had enough transferred, I removed the collar from the liquid and let the jacket dry. Once it dried, I was able to see a similar pattern of this random line of white material in the area where the collar had been dipped. And all I ended up finding basically was the sodium and the chlorine. So I was able to basically solve the puzzle to some degree that the jacket certainly could have been in contact with seawater. And because the elements that I found on my test area were indistinguishable from the elements I found from the questioned area.
The evidence was not sufficient to put Kelly at the scene of the crime. However, Catherine Murray has an idea of how the jacket might still be put to good use. Murray develops another tactic. She asks Warren to testify at Kelly's second trial.
Warren, by this time, was serving his sentence, and he was just working on himself. He was getting involved in all sorts of programs, taking counseling.
Warren agrees to testify. 7 years after the crime, Kelly Ellard's second trial begins. This time, Kelly will have to face Warren for the first time since their arrest.
Her demeanor was interesting. In direct examination by her lawyer, she was one way, and then in cross-examination, she kinda turned. And she kept telling me to hurry up. I was wasting her time. She'd cry. She'd deny over and over. At one point she said, no matter what you say, the answer's no. It was kind of an interesting examination. Warren told a very compelling story. He told how he and Kelly then started attacking the victim, beating her, punching her, how she fell to the ground. They started kicking her, stomping on her, actually physically getting on her, stomping up and down on her until she stopped moving, clearly unconscious. How Kelly then took one of the victim's feet. He took the other, and how they started to drag her towards the water. How once they got to the water's edge, he stopped. And he watched as Kelly dragged the victim into the water up to about her waist. And then how Kelly held the victim's head underwater until she stopped moving. He then told us how the victim was floating.
At the end of Kelly's cross-examination, Catherine Murray pulls out the jacket and shows it to Kelly. The courtroom is shocked by Kelly's reaction.
I just held it up and I said, the jacket tells the story, doesn't it? And she sort of broke down and said, you've got what you wanted. I'm going to be convicted. I'm going to be in jail for the rest of my life. Does that make you happy? Words to that effect.
The jury's verdict? A bombshell.
After 5 days of deliberations, Ellard number 2 resulted in a hung jury. 11 guilty and 1 not guilty. When that happened, we immediately got on the phone and we started phoning the witnesses, told them, and they said they'd be there for us again. So we started up again and did Ellard 3. Warren came through again, and Kelly was found guilty. Murder, second-degree murder.
Kelly Ellard appeals yet again, but in 2009, her conviction is reinstated, putting an end to a legal case that spanned more than a decade. In 2007, after his apology to the Verk family, Warren Golowatsky is granted day parole.
I don't think this girl died in vain. Her legacy has accomplished a lot. This made international news at the time. And what it did is it brought the issue of youth violence to the forefront, not just in this city or in this province, but right across the country. And it was significant.
Warren and Kelly believed that water would hide their secrets. But that was not the case. For Rena Verk, justice has been served. Source of life and cause of death, water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. It was one of the most notorious crimes in Canadian history. A crime so evil and chilling, it captivated the people of Southern Ontario for more than a year. This case is protected by the Youth Criminal Justice Act. The identities of the victim, the defendants, and the witnesses cannot be revealed. Mississauga, Ontario is a quiet Toronto suburb. On January 18, 2003 at 10:35 p.m., a 911 call is received at the Peel Regional District Call Center. A distraught young girl tells the operator that her mother has drowned in the bathtub. The police and emergency response teams are dispatched to a house in a middle-class neighborhood. The two hysterical teenage sisters open the door. They point to the upstairs bathroom and tell the emergency personnel that their mother has drowned in the bathtub. The paramedics pull her body from the tub and attempt to resuscitate the mother, but she is unresponsive. They cover her body with a sheet and leave it for the coroner to examine when he arrives.
Right from the beginning, bathtub drownings don't occur very often, and so they have to be looked at with a degree of suspicion. So this was a suspicious death. I still have difficulty with believing that people drown in bathtubs on their own. I know it's possible to it, but I still have that mindset going in that until I prove it to myself, I don't believe it.
Forensic Identification Officer Bernie Weber arrives at the house. His first task is to observe and photograph the scene.
I actually arrived just shortly before the coroner. And so I go in, I photograph everything the way that I find it. I don't touch anything, I don't move anything. You know, I don't even take the blanket off of the deceased. And I don't even want to get in to start moving anything until the coroner gives me that sort of authorization. I want him to see the scene the way that I have. We still didn't know exactly what we were dealing with. I did some photographs in other areas of the home, one which showed the living room, where everything was relatively neat and tidy, but there was a vodka bottle which was lying on its side on the coffee table.
While Weber continues his inventory of the scene, Inspector Brent Magnus begins his preliminary investigation. He will be the first person to record the sisters' version of the events. They tell him they went to meet friends for dinner at Jack Astor's restaurant around 6 p.m. When they left, their mother was drinking heavily. When they returned around 10:30, they were shocked to find their mother unconscious, face down in the bathtub.
During that brief interview or talking with the girls, they requested to go to the aunts. She agreed that the girls could stay with her. It was close by, and it was easy to take them to a place of safety.
The girls are escorted to their aunt's house nearby.
That scene was initially identified as a sudden death scene, and the coroner would have responsibility over that particular scene.
The coroner arrives. He and Bernie Weber begin to reconstruct the sequence of events.
A normal size, between 5'2" and 5'5". She was slightly overweight. Whenever you start to move a body and they talk about that dead weight, it would have been very difficult, actually, even just for her small size, to try to get her out of the bathtub like the fire department did. So for things not to be completely knocked over within the bathroom wasn't a surprise. It was actually still relatively in order. So I was asked by the coroner to fingerprint her in order to identify her. I take a dark fingerprint powder on a brush. I put the powder onto the skin itself, and then what I do is I put a piece of tape over top of that finger, and then as I pull it away, I get that impression. So I'm left with the fingerprint impression, and I can use that for comparison.
They are looking for clues that will tell them whether this was an accident or a homicide. In a case like this, the tiniest clue can take the investigation in a whole new direction. What has appeared to be just an accident can suddenly turn into a cold-blooded murder.
She had a little bit of liquid coming out of her mouth, which is very common in all drowning cases because that's the normal process of the body getting rid of the liquid.
Nos poumons, dans une noyade.
When a person drowns, there is moisture in the lungs. Some of it may come from the water they drowned in, but some also comes from their own body. The blood draws it into the lungs because of the lack of oxygen. That moisture is rich in proteins because there are a lot of proteins in the blood, and some of them will cross into the lungs. Those proteins get mixed with the air. So when you press the lungs, foam comes out. You see that foam in the respiratory tract, but even before you begin the autopsy, often there is a big mushroom of foam around the nose and the mouth.
Before long, Weber and the coroner begin to notice details that arouse their suspicions.
We started to see things like we had 2 different glasses within the bathroom itself that had alcohol in it. I started to make other observations within the tub itself. There was 6 inches of water depth within the tub. So with the body in there, it would have obviously displaced, but the water had cooled down to air temperature. So I would expect in a normal situation, if it had been a normal bath, that the water would have been warmer.
The water temperature will help determine the time of death.
It's just a matter of process. Whenever you're dealing with a drowning, a water sample should always be taken at that time, and so that's what I did there. But also in the bottom of the tub, there was a granular material, and that appeared to be either vomitous or fecal matter that had just mixed in with the water. This was not collected at that time because we were still in that process of trying to determine what sort of death that we had. So that was left in there because if something suspicious had come out of the post-mortem examination, I knew that we would be returning to the home under a criminal code warrant and we could grab that at that time.
The mother's body shows no signs of struggle, and no evidence of foul play can be found. But the investigators still consider this a suspicious death.
We were hoping that something would come out of the post-mortem examination that would lead us to conclude one way or the other.
The house is sealed off until after the autopsy. Police officers are posted to ensure that no one can enter the home and that all potential evidence remains intact. So far, everything seems to point to an accidental drowning. But in cases such as this, the final determination cannot be made until the autopsy has been completed. It is often the pathologist who finds evidence of foul play. Mississauga, Ontario. A woman is discovered in her bathtub by her 15 and 16-year-old daughters. The investigators are very suspicious since bathtub drownings are extremely rare. An autopsy is ordered to determine the cause of death. Back in his office, Bernie Weber prepares his report. It will be used by the pathologist at the autopsy the following day. He compares the victim's fingerprints to those in the RCMP database to confirm her identity.
I wanted to ensure that she was in fact the lady that we thought she was. I was able to pull the fingerprints, I made that comparison, and then I subsequently notified the coroner, identified this lady, as well as the officer in charge.
The following day, Dr. Timothy Feltis prepares for the autopsy.
I've done about almost 4,000 medical legal cases over my career. Drowning actually is still not that common. I've probably done perhaps maybe 25 drownings, and I've done maybe 6 or 7 that have occurred in a bathtub. From a forensic pathology point of view, any death in a bathtub is highly suspicious. It's unusual for people to die in a bathtub full of water. Automatically, we treated this as a homicide right from the get-go. A homicide autopsy in this case, with a death in water, meant that we had to do some very specific things. We'll take blood samples that will be used for toxicology. We'll take urine samples that will be used for toxicology. We also take a sample of stomach contents. That's kind of a backup. In this case, we don't usually use the stomach contents all the time, and it is submitted to the Center for Forensic Science. In this case, we also took an extra sample of blood and took it up to our pathology lab and ran it for alcohol. Often when people die in a bathtub, they may be strangled. So that means we have to do what's called a dry neck dissection, whereby we remove the chest and abdominal organs and the brain before we even go near the neck. That is so that we decrease any chance of introducing artifactual blood into the neck by removing those organs. Secondly, we would obviously make a very, very detailed search of that body for any evidence of trauma, including bruising, scratches, abrasions, etc.
What we're seeing is blood vessels deep down that have ruptured, so blood has collected there. Through the skin, we see the bluish or reddish area. The medical term is ecchymosis, but in everyday language, we call it a bruise. But if the area where there is bleeding is very small or very deep, or if the skin is very dark, sometimes the injuries aren't visible. So as a precaution, we open all the tissue in the back and the back of the legs to see whether there are any injuries we have missed.
The other thing that's important in this case to realize is that this woman who died was considered to be an alcoholic. Often, in alcoholic people, we will see evidence of bruising from various falls. What's interesting in this case is that there are no old bruises on this woman's body. Now, that doesn't mean that she isn't an alcoholic. She may be what are called a careful drunk. So I would have expected in this case that if there's a long history of alcoholism, that we might have seen evidence of previous falls with some bruising. That was not evident in this case at all.
The results of the blood analysis have returned from the lab.
We immediately, during the course of the autopsy, knew that this woman had a significantly elevated blood alcohol level in the range of 400 milligrams per 100 mLs. That is a potentially fatal level of alcohol.
Levels of only 325 milligrams per 100 milliliters can be fatal to an average person.
Now, somebody who's a chronic alcoholic might be very much different, but it's certainly a level under which somebody might pass out in a bathtub and accidentally drown. If you've taken enough alcohol and it depresses your central nervous system, it might suppress the cough response you have to get that water out of your lungs. And so that you can take the water in, the water just flows in a lot more easily than it would if you weren't inebriated with alcohol. Any death in a bathtub has to be suspicious. All the findings was we had this high level of alcohol in a relatively young woman who had signs of freshwater drowning and no evidence of trauma. We didn't have any evidence that directly pointed to a homicide. You need absolute proof, and in terms of the autopsy, there wasn't any.
The coroner compares the autopsy results with his own observations and the testimony of the victim's daughters. He concludes that the cause of death was accidental drowning due to excessive alcohol consumption. Peel District Police closed the file. The sister's aunt becomes their legal guardian. The girls inherit nearly $200,000 from their mother's life insurance policy. However, 11 months later, a surprising piece of evidence is brought to the attention of the Peel police, and the case is reopened. In Mississauga, Ontario, a woman is discovered drowned in her bathtub. Her teenage daughters find her body and call the police. Investigators are very suspicious because bathtub drownings are extremely rare. A full investigation, autopsy, and toxicology are carried out. The coroner concludes that it's an accidental drowning due to toxic levels of alcohol, and the case is closed. "11 months later, a teenage boy contacts the police with surprising information about the bathtub drowning.
This individual received some information from the older of the two sisters. He became aware of certain information and that the mother had actually been murdered or forcibly drowned in the bathtub of the residence.
Brent Magnus must first prove that the young man is telling the truth.
I discussed it with a Crown attorney because initially when this information came forward through the friend, I realized that we would have to go to an authorization to intercept communications in order to corroborate what this friend was telling us.
The police examine the young man's computer. They find online conversations between him and the older sister that are very disturbing.
He was providing us information that only the girls would be privy to, and that they had actually murdered their mother.
The case is reopened and becomes a criminal investigation. The police begin to plan an undercover operation with a young man playing the lead role. Even though he has been friends with the sisters for many years, this operation could put his life at risk.
He had been a longtime friend of the girls. Both families growing up were fairly close.
The police provide the young man with a car wired with audio and video recording equipment.
He acted pretty much in a capacity as an agent for the police, and through some guidance with an agent handler, was able to meet with the girls and again engage both girls in conversation relating to the murder.
During the next 4 weeks, the young informant records many incriminating conversations with the sisters.
He went out to meet the older of the two sisters. He obtained a statement from her with respect to the murders, and it was obvious from reviewing and transcribing that entire intercept that the older sister and possibly the younger sister were definitely involved in the murder of their mother.
The first intercepted conversation is chilling. The older sister openly reveals details of the murder that they had been planning for months.
I think initially you don't want to believe that a 15 and 16-year-old would murder a parent, and especially their mother.
I mean, the videotape that the police set up was brilliant because these girls had no idea they were being videotaped. In fact, at one point, I think it's the older girl, she gets into the car and the first thing she says to their friend is, I'm not being videotaped, am I?
The sisters came from a broken home. For many years, their mother had been turning to alcohol to deaden the pain of 2 failed marriages.
They were able to use the mother's weaknesses against her, which was the recent relationship breakup with her boyfriend. When this occurred, she would consume alcohol.
Over the course of a few weeks, the young informant meets the sisters 4 times. The meetings produce many hours of recordings and dozens of leads that must be followed up. One startling discovery comes out in the first recording. The girls had given their mother deadly cocktails of vodka and Tylenol 3, a potent painkiller containing high levels of codeine.
We realized we should do a toxicology test looking specifically for codeine.
A warrant is issued to release the blood and urine samples taken from the mother a year earlier.
A full analysis on the samples and relayed to us that the mother had an abnormal amount of codeine in her system at the time of her death.
The investigators have the proof they need. The next step is to plan how to arrest the sisters and their accomplices.
I had officers assigned to find out what schools they went to and any other background information we could dig up on them.
The police are concerned that news of the arrests will spread quickly through the community. They're afraid the accomplices might have the opportunity to consolidate their alibis.
Because the younger generation of people are in communication with one another more readily through cell phones, through Blackberries, internet, it wouldn't take a very long period of time for individuals to realize that the girls were arrested.
It would be difficult to prevent accomplices from communicating online and covering up important information. The investigators had to come up with a fail-safe strategy. In Mississauga, Ontario, 2 teenage girls report that their mother has drowned at home in the bathtub. At the time, it is determined that the death was due to excessive alcohol intoxication, and it's ruled accidental. The case is closed. 1 year later, the police received disturbing information suggesting the death was not an accident. With the help of an informant, the police obtained enough evidence to trap the two teenage killers. On January 21st at 7 a.m., the police served warrants for the arrest of the two sisters for the murder of their mother. The sisters are taken into custody, still dressed in their pajamas.
They were brought into the homicide area of Peel Regional Police. They were obviously separated. We did not want them talking or influencing each other during that process. I had officers obtain specific clothing for them so that they would be dressed appropriately. They both declined to wear anything but the pajamas that they were wearing when they were arrested. At the same time, I had approximately 50 to 55 officers that were out involved in the execution of the search warrant at the residence, searching the residence, and I had identified approximately 45 other individuals that I needed interviewed within a very short period of time. Anybody I thought could provide us information on the girls or the murder of the mother, and I had to keep in the back of my mind to have the girls' family interviewed first.
The conversations intercepted by the informant show that the girls had been speaking openly with their friends about the crime that they had committed.
Young people who commit this type of crime and brag about it afterwards face a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to prove that they are capable of action, that they're not all talk. But on the other hand, the more they talk about it, the more they risk getting caught.
Detective Magnus wanted to make sure he was able to question the immediate family members before the two accused could talk to them. He had to ensure that a lawyer was present when the two girls were being interrogated.
They were given the opportunity to speak with counsel almost immediately. Any other adult or family member that they would feel confident in speaking with, and they were given the opportunity to have those individuals present with them during any interview that would take place.
Right from the start, both sisters denied any involvement in their mother's death. But it soon becomes apparent to the police that the older sister is extremely nervous. After several hours of questioning, she finally breaks down in tears. She admits to her role in the murder and describes it in detail. Then, remarkably, she curls up on the floor and falls asleep.
That's not uncommon. I've been involved in several arrests where individuals have an adrenaline dump or some type of change physically, that once they have been arrested, they, for some reason, fall asleep.
But the younger sister continues to deny any involvement in her mother's drowning.
No, after several hours of speaking with her, she did not provide any information to police. However, the two girls wanted to speak with one another. I made the decision to allow that to happen, and they did speak to one another about the murder.
They put the two girls together, and they come up with this scheme about how they were going to pretend it was all a big joke they were putting on their friend, and that's the story they're going to tell the police. So they come back into the rooms again, and she says, "Well, can you be in trouble for lying to police?" And the officer says, "Well, what do you mean lying?" He says, "Well, I didn't kill my mother. I was just lying to you."
The older sister's retraction leaves the investigators with just one promising lead: the logs of the online chat stored on the girls' computer hard drives. Joe Colson from the Technological Crime Unit examines the computers.
They're taken back to the Technological Crime Lab, and the computers themselves are physically taken apart, at which time we forensically image the hard drive. Basically, we copy the drive from start to finish. Every bit is copied. We do it in such a way that we can prove that the image that we have taken is identical to the original computer, and we do all our work from the forensic copy of that drive. When you delete something from your computer, that file, pretty much in its entirety, is still resident on that computer. A typical user will go in and say, okay, I should delete that now. As far as the chat goes, you can physically go in and delete that chat. But again, with the software programs that we use, sometimes we can recover that.
As Colson recovers the files, he begins to piece together the girl's sinister story. And it's not exactly what the investigators had expected.
These two girls were brilliant kids. One of their guidance counselors said that they were the most intelligent kids that he'd ever seen in 30 years of teaching. But he said their best quality was their ability to manipulate people.
Their online chats paint a picture of an unhappy family life. Their mother had been in 2 difficult relationships with abusive men. They accused their mother of spending more money on alcohol than on their well-being. They began to fantasize about a better life without their mother.
Within a very short period of time, their entire lifestyle started to change. Around the time that they came up with the plan, they started hanging out with different people than they used to. They started skipping school, started using drugs and alcohol. I realized after examining some of the intercepts that this was actually not a spur-of-the-moment homicide or murder, that this was planned and calculated, researched by both individuals. The mother, unbeknownst to the girls, was saving money for them, providing them a good home life, and working several jobs to provide that. The girls didn't recognize that. Once the girls sat down and came up with the idea of killing their mother for insurance monies, I believe they hatched a plan through research and talking with some friends. Probably the most important part of the analysis on this case was keywords and the analysis of keyword hits on these drives.
The investigators used specially designed software to help them sift through the enormous volume of data.
All of their conversations were being logged on the computer. I don't know whether they knew it was logged or not, but it was being logged on their computer. The first hit that we got was alcohol effects and Tylenol. And that was sort of that first glimpse. When I found that first shred of evidence, that first smoking gun, there was the adrenaline. It was like, there it is. Came up with the idea of getting her intoxicated and providing her pills to incapacitate her. They actually did research into the amount of alcohol, the amount of Tylenol or codeine and its effects mixed with alcohol, and the amount of time necessary to drown a person or hold them underwater to facilitate a murder.
The police recover information that proves the girls had been actively planning their mother's murder for months. But the 2 sisters had not acted alone.
We were able to show that the girls were actually chatting with this particular individual, and that he was willing to be an alibi for the 2 girls. He actually did show up the night of the murder at a local restaurant to act as an alibi.
The young accomplice was also a lifeguard. He was well aware of how easy it is to drown someone.
He provided the one sister with Tylenol pills, sufficient enough to incapacitate the mother along with the alcohol.
For an entire year, the sisters have managed to get away with the perfect crime. Now the time has come for the investigators to build the perfect prosecution. Southern Ontario is shocked by the news that a 1-year-old accidental drowning case has been escalated to murder. The accused are 2 teenage sisters from Mississauga. They are arrested and charged with drowning their mother. After months in a detention center, the 2 sisters are accompanied by their lawyers to their bail hearing. Surprisingly, they are still wearing their pajamas.
I've covered, hundreds and hundreds of cases, the last 10, 15 covering crime, and I'd never ever seen 2 girls so young show up in court dressed in their pajamas, especially 2 girls who were allegedly arrested for killing their mother. And I thought, what's going on here?
Their immediate family and circle of friends believe the police have made a terrible mistake.
In fact, during the bail hearing, there was laughter throughout the whole courtroom. The father didn't believe it, the aunts certainly didn't believe it, their cousins thought it was a big joke.
After their hearing, their lawyers talked to the media.
Their lawyers came out and said that, these poor girls were wrestled out of bed and they weren't allowed to dress, and the cops did this, and it's just a terrible story. And of course, what we didn't know at the time was the girls lived in their pajamas, refused to get dressed, and had spent the better part of the day before just sparring with seasoned interviewers about what happened.
Masters of manipulation, the sisters begin to sway public opinion using their lawyers, family, and friends.
There was a lot of media coverage. Young girls killing their mother, how could that happen? Let's feel sorry, it must have been their lifestyle, the mother must have been abusive. Some 4 months after their arrest, they were given bail with specific conditions placed on them by the judge. And one of those conditions was being to remain within the residence where they were residing, which was the aunt's house.
The girls are released from the detention center and placed under house arrest with their aunt until the trial.
It just meant that they weren't free to do anything they wanted. I mean, they could go to school if they could have. They could have gone to doctor appointments. They could go to work if they wanted. They just had to be with somebody chaperoning them.
Some of the computers were given back to the family. We actually obtained a lot of the evidence from a computer that had been brought with them from their previous residence.
The sisters continue their deception. The family still believes the girls are innocent, but their online chats tell a completely different story.
And they spend that entire year living at the aunt's house. And this is the aunt whose sister they have killed. And everybody supports them. They think the police have made a terrible mistake.
With the same computers they used to hatch their diabolical plan, the sisters continue their online chats and brag about how they've been able to fool everyone. When the investigation is complete, the sisters' cruel, clever plan is finally brought to light. While the sisters are under house arrest, the logs of their previous online chats are examined with a fine-tooth comb. Investigators are then able to piece together a detailed timeline of the events that led up to the murder. The evidence clearly proves that the sisters had planned to kill their mother in cold blood.
It's our belief that the girls poured drinks for the mother, provided her pills, which was not abnormal for them to do that.
The mixture of alcohol and codeine from the Tylenol 3 soon puts their mother in an almost unconscious state. While their mother is heavily sedated, the sisters fill the tub and prepare the bathroom. They help their mother up the stairs, taking great care that she doesn't fall and bruise herself. The older sister helps her mother climb into the tub. Telephone and computer records proved that the sisters were communicating with their friends as they prepared to drown their mother. The older sister puts on latex gloves, then holds her mother's head under 15 centimeters of water until she stops breathing. The sisters rush out of the house. In order to establish an alibi, they have arranged to meet a girlfriend and their accomplice, the lifeguard, at a local restaurant. After dinner, they return home and stage their 911 call.
The older sister makes the call, the younger sister is in the background. The older sister sounds like she is upset. But when you review that with other evidence in the case, you realize that she was play acting. 911 operators asked the girls to provide the mother assistance if they found her just drowned in the tub. When police first responded, there was some evidence of rigidity, rigor mortis, and lividity, which would indicate that it had transpired several hours prior to the girls calling 911.
One year after their arrest, the trial begins. They become known as the Bathtub Sisters.
People ask me, was this a hard trial to sit through? And you must have been, aghast by all this. Every day, myself and other reporters who covered it couldn't wait to get to the courtroom because we just couldn't wait to find out what was going to come next. The Crown attorneys would say, if you thought this was good, stay tuned.
The sisters have two motives for their crime. One is to escape from an abusive home life and an alcoholic parent. The other is just plain greed. They know their mother has a life insurance policy worth nearly $200,000.
That's what makes this whole thing bizarre, chilling, disturbing. There were three close friends who knew it was going to happen beforehand, knew afterwards. Nobody ever goes to their parents, nobody goes to police, nobody goes to any authority figure whatsoever. And I think during that whole year they got away with it. There had to be hundreds of kids in two different high schools that either suspected they had killed their mother or knew firsthand they had done it, but nobody ever tells anybody.
Their accomplices eventually testify against the girls and help to convict them. The young male accomplice is also arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. As the trial progresses, the police continue to bring forward new evidence found on the seized computers.
The technical evidence added so much validity and so much weight to these other witnesses' statements because we were able to corroborate what these witnesses were saying. The digital evidence in this particular case really became the crux of the case. To my knowledge, this is probably one of the foremost technical investigations that took place in this country at that time.
After a trial lasting several weeks, Justice Bruce Duncan hands down his decision.
Their mother, obviously.
He says the two defendants set out to commit the perfect crime, but instead, they created the perfect prosecution. The case against them is overwhelming. He declares that this is the strongest case he has ever seen in over 30 years of prosecuting and judging criminal cases. He finds the defendants guilty of first-degree murder.
They were convicted as youth under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. It meant that all they could serve was a maximum of 10 years. First-degree murder, that's the most you can serve. You can only serve a maximum of 6 years in custody. The rest can be served in a halfway house, even in their own house under house arrest eventually. When they get released after that 10-year period is up, they can go anywhere in Canada. They don't really need to get new names because nobody will know their names. But for the average public, they'll always be known as the Bathtub Girls.
I feel strongly that everybody came to the same conclusion that these two girls were evil.
The horrific thing about this is that these were 15 and 16-year-old kids, and they almost got away with the perfect crime.
The deadly power of water was used to cover up an almost perfect crime. The mother's drowning would have gone unpunished had it not been for one person following his conscience. Once again, water would have been a ruthless accomplice. Silent. Perfect.